All right. Once again, I'm asking you to come back from your conversations, come back from the lunch. Hopefully you've all gotten enough. I think there's still some in the back. If you'd like to get some more food for lunch or a cup of coffee or something, that's still in the back. So we are moving on to the strategic planning portion of the program. As Dana was describing before lunch, hopefully you've had a chance to think a little bit about the prompts that we've put up here. We would like to get your best thoughts, or even your mediocre thoughts, or even less, whatever thoughts you have. Well, we want to capture it all. And we were doing that in a couple different ways. So each table, and Dana labeled them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 around the perimeter. We'll take one of the prompts.
Where's 3?
3 is there.
Thank you.
So we hope that people will distribute themselves relatively evenly. We want to make sure that one of the prompts doesn't have any people or only 2 people or something. So we're hoping that people will reasonably easily distribute themselves around those 5 themes, those 5 prompts, and have good conversations. Again, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What we would like you to do is talk about the prompts, think about the prompts. We will ask a single individual, or could be more, but probably a single individual from each of the tables to report out after about 25 minutes or so. Short report outs, doesn't have to be super long, but we want you to share your ideas so that we can all hear them. So one person should be acting as the person who will be reporting out, and that probably capturing the ideas in a way that makes sense to them and that they can share with others. That's someone that's out there from the coalition. The members of the executive committee, plus Harley, are going to be also sitting at each of the tables, kind of just making sure that we capture everything. So, in case there's comments that don't make it into the final report out, that at least we have that to come back to, and we can digest that at a later point. There are actually enough of the prompt sheets at each table, I think, for everybody. There should be 10 at each table. So if your comments and thoughts aren't being captured in one way or another, write them down. We will look at them. And the last part, really, what are the top 5 items that the coalition absolutely needs to accomplish to achieve life transformative education over the next 3 years? Everybody can answer that one if you'd like. So please feel free to fill that out individually. You don't have to put your name unless you really want to. But we really want to capture your wisdom. And I can imagine those top ideas as really being collected and really kind of voting with your feet as to what things are important to us. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry. I was going to say, anyone but him. 5 people are, like, some of these questions are getting like 2 tables worth.
Right, so long as people distribute themselves, we need everybody to distribute. And I don't know if we can get 10 people around each table, so you might need to distribute yourself a little bit. But we want input on at least all of the questions, all of the prompts.
I'm undergraduate research in precision science, but I'm a chemist, not an engineer.
Again, and we want to hear some of your thoughts in real time, and certainly we want to be able to capture them. So anything that certainly we have people who are reporting out. I know some of us took some notes as well. If there are other aspects of the conversation that weren't quite captured, make sure that we get them somehow. There's the pieces of paper in front of you, or there could be connecting with us later. Let me make one last pitch, if I may, for telling us your top 5. So we're going to try, I'd love to get the top 5 from each and every one of you. I don't know if I know Joe had to leave early, but Joe was talking about having 300 initiatives, which is mind-blowing to me, that he actually could keep track of and maybe even see progress on. There are roughly 50 people in the room. If we get 5 great ideas or items that we need to prioritize in the next several years from each of you, that will give us 250 that we can start digesting and processing and measuring and figuring out whether we can achieve those or not. So please do individually, this is beyond just the table report outs, individually take the piece of paper in front of you, based on the conversation or your own ideas or the ideas that you've heard from others, and write down those 5 things that you think are absolutely needed to accomplish and to achieve life-transforming education over the next 3 years. That's pretty specific, actually. So please go ahead and do that if you haven't already. We'd like to get one from each of you. Okay. Which table would like to report out first? We've got about 10, 15 minutes we can probably take. Who would like to go first? Okay. And we want to make sure that we record this. So I've been reminded that I should make sure that everyone has a mic when they're talking so we capture the audio. And if you can stand up here, that's even better. It makes it easier for our camera person.
All right. So we were group, what are things that we need to prioritize to achieve our goals, and what are things that we might need to think about more efficiently? I wanted to actually start with the top five, because that really shaped a lot of our thinking around the first question. So the 5 things that we really emphasize as critical in the next 3 years, although some might take longer, is the establishment of a sustainable funding model. Making sure that the assessments that we do are multi-dimensional, meaning that we can dig as deep as we need to create the narratives that are necessary to be able to push our work forward. We need a theory of change. I think that we sort of took that from the panel, and we really need to think about what is the theory of change, and has the theory of change changed from when it was first designed? How do we capture the narrative of higher education back? Really starting to think about our public-facing role in the power of a coalition of lots of member universities that share a vision for what the role of higher education is, and how can we then support that? And then lastly, the marketing and communication part. I think that the table couldn't emphasize enough that that's a science in and of itself, of how we reach multiple different stakeholders. That's parents, that's children, that's universities, but importantly, that's legislators, that's our employer partners, that's communities, and so on, to really understand what the role is and how everything comes together. Okay, I'm going to be really quickly in terms of expansion. In terms of the question that we were answering, which was around where we should focus our efforts within our current operations. We really did identify this kind of the role of the membership universities versus partnerships versus promotion as experimentation, capacity building, and awareness. And then we really zoned in on the role of the coalition to scale practices as much as possible. So really trying to maximize the number of members that we have, but doing it in a way that is intentional and allows us to capture what practices might look like in small versus large institutions, public versus private, which is the driving goal. Making sure that we are able to assess the increased experimentation, which will then lead to a promotion, and you can see that vicious cycle going around and around. So really prioritizing membership, followed by really supporting institutions to be our voice, rather than the institutions providing examples to the coalition to be the voice. I'm really trying to take a networked approach to be able to achieve that. Did I miss anything? Yeah, I think that it's really important that we really zone in on the value proposition and how we move forward with that. That's us.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. Which table would like to go next?
I think you just.
Okay, table number 1. You can get it.
Okay, we were in group number 1, which was focused on what the mission is, as well as the drivers of the mission. And For part of our time, we talked a little bit about who constitutes the leaders in the mission statement alongside who is the audience for the coalition. So talked a little bit about who do we want the mission to be able to speak to and who in particular is the coalition for. And certainly we came to the conclusion that this is a group that is for leaders in higher education. It isn't necessarily for students themselves, though the work of the coalition is certainly aligned with supporting students for lifelong well-being. We then talked a lot about the mission and how it seems to include the what and the who and the how, and perhaps it needs to be simplified a bit in order to just focus on the what. And so we talked through a few different options for that, and thinking through what would the coalition want to be able to measure when we're thinking about this what. So one of those examples or one of those ideas took the last line of the mission statement and worked with that a little bit. So one possibility is to, instead of we inspire, we could do something like we support, prepare, or equip the academy leaders in higher education to prioritize lifelong well-being. And then we simplified that even further, focusing on, okay, can we think of what the purpose is? And came to the statement of the purpose is to transform higher education so students have high quality of lifelong well-being. And with something like this, you would be able to do some of the assessment to be able to see how our students being transformed as a result of the work that the coalition is doing in order to provide support for leaders. And then the last part, or the last area that we really focused on was, and I keep looking back here because the mission and the drivers were up there a little bit ago. Do we want to add anything alongside belonging, agency, identity? And we talked a lot about character. One thing that we talked about with character is that the right word? Does that resonate with people? Is that kind of one of those words that puts people off? And should it be something like values or public good? And I think our last point along with that discussion was certainly different institutions are going to have different words that resonate with their faculty, their staff, and their students. But one argument for using character in particular is that there is quite a movement across several universities, Wake Forest, for example, that they are using character and leadership. And because there is such broad interest and such a movement across many campuses, that this would potentially allow for more of those folks to connect in with the coalition, which would make this a space that had the potential to grow, building off of the momentum in those spaces.
Nice. Thank you so much. Wonderful. All right, next group, okay.
So we were group 5, future initiatives and innovative opportunities, and we had a similar conversation about the word character. I think it's all, we have to blame William Bennett. Remember William Bennett? And this reminds me of, right, the left trying to take back the American flag. But it is, certainly it's controversial. We had the same conversation, but that wasn't the primary conversation. Since we didn't do the top 5 items and sort of vote on it or come to a consensus. Because I'm the scribe and my hand hurts now, I get to choose the top 5. No, based on, I think this might be close. So number 1 was, I shouldn't say number 1. One of them was increasing student participation in the CTE work. So I think there was a lot of consensus and agreement there. So in terms, all the work. Also, there was a lot of discussion about the need to clarify the definitions, what constitutes agency and belonging. There, concern that if it's too ambiguous and too broad, then it loses its significance, right? So there was that discussion. Can CTE put forward a toolkit or provide, best practices, or that sort of age-old, how do you define what it is we're talking about? There was also discussion about the need for advocacy, and that CTE could play an important role in terms of advocacy because, for example, maybe some organizations that have been leading on higher ed might not be seen as favorably. AAC&U, again, not trying to attack AAC&U, but just that perhaps CTE and the work that we're doing, maybe it spans the political spectrum, and so we might be able to be helpful there. That's seen as important. And then we did talk a lot about the polarization in the country, and as someone said, if you look back, can't think of where there was a time where we were talking about a need for a constructive dialogue institute, but here we are, and so there was a lot of discussion about that, and maybe in terms of partnerships, maybe we need a more robust partnership with CDI, for example. And then using the scribe's privilege, I brought up accreditation because I think that's going to be well, it's been signaled that that's going to be an area of it that the new administration coming in doesn't find the current regional accreditation favorably. So I used to be a state legislator, so I see things in this bifurcated manner, but fortunately we have more integrative thinkers like Thomas. So I was saying that you have, from a neoliberal perspective, this notion that this administration might come in and say, college, the purpose of college is to train workers. And that's its only real purpose. Whereas, of course, the work that CTE is doing, Thomas, and I forgot how to pronounce your last name. Exactly. I can do an Italian name, but I can't do a Greek name. So, all right. Yeah, all right. Wow. Throwing some shade on the fellow. All right. That fortunately, as Thomas pointed out, we have the best of both worlds because we talk about the, humanity and developing the entire human, but we also talk and show that well-being is connected with, understanding your career and your mission and your purpose. And I'll really quickly, the other things that we talked about more in terms of number 5, future. So those were all discussed, and I think those can be part of what we're looking at in the future. But there was a question about should we focus more on grad students too, or on grad students, and so that was a discussion. And then also recognizing the diversity of students. So certain terms. Right? Arguably, this is kind of a Western Eurocentric perspective, so there was concern there about how, what does that mean and how we should think about that. There was no consensus. So I'll just stop there.
That's great. Thank you so much. Great. 2 more tables to go.
Thanks, Keith. So good afternoon. Our group had number 4, how do we best communicate and expand our impact? We essentially talked about 3 main buckets. The first one really was a general question, which is, so what's the coalition's niche? Particularly in this crowded landscape of higher education reform and coalitions and consortiums, big ones that we've all known the names of for years as academics, smaller ones that maybe are up and coming. And so when one asks, what does your coalition do when asked by a funder, it would be really important to be able to say, oh, this is how we're tackling higher ed in 2024, 2025, and leave it at that. And one of the things that Marjorie referenced was that would be a Rick question would be, so what is our end goal here, right? What's the purpose of this coalition? The second bucket really was around external communications, right? And one of the things that Donna mentioned in relation to that, so what's our niche, is there are several smaller coalitions, consortiums, groups that do this work that are aligned with what we do, right? Maybe they take a holistic well-being approach to things. Maybe they're a bit more niche when it comes to mental health. But the reality is that in and of itself, we might be able to serve a purpose to higher ed by bringing these coalitions together. Not under one umbrella, if you will, but facilitating discussions, answering questions from a perspective that we might be able to do very differently from something much larger than who we are. We did spend the majority of our time talking about internal communications, particularly if we can better define, and this was talked a little bit about, what do we mean by agency? What do we mean by identity? What do we mean by purpose? What do we mean by well-being, right? And so if we're able to define those terms, then how do we help the coalition first? And so one of the things that we talked about was this notion of, so what are coalition members doing in this area of transformational education? And if you're thinking about the drivers that are here, identity, belonging, agency, and purpose, and the other two or three that were part of the framework that I can't remember because it's been a long afternoon, is it possible for us to be able to facilitate for our member institutions, the Leadership and Character Program at Wake Forest University would slot under that driver. And this community college pipeline program that we have at Valdosta State would slot under this driver, so that members of the coalition can go to this inventory of drivers and actions. And this is one of the things that Maria said at our table. What actions are we doing? Communications words are great, but can you at least tell me what you're actually doing? And so we can learn from each other. We can go to a website, we can click on a drop-down menu and an accordion menu and go, Andrew's doing this agency work at WashU, I gotta get to St. Louis or at least caucus with him the next time I see him. The one last thing, and I'll reference Maria one more time. Maria works at the University of Florida, that is my hometown.
I work at the University of Miami.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that was a Freudian slip because I went to the University of Florida, so that's my other hometown. I know. But the one thing that Maria helped us understand is that even a private school in a state like Florida is under scrutiny from state legislatures. And so the notion at UM, I almost said UF again, it's the better school. So the one thing, meanwhile, my colleague is like, Jose, quit, just take the mic from Jose. The thing that's important to think about for private schools in particular is at UM, you get $200 million from the state. And even though it's a private school, it's still under scrutiny from the state legislature. And so things like diversity, equity, and inclusion are no longer allowed to be spoken in my home state, at my alma mater in particular. And so what Maria doubled down on was this notion of actions. So when students at UM, medical students, undergrads, law students say, where are your statements on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Maria can say, let me do you one better. Here are the things that UM is doing around health equity, for example, in medical school, around pilot projects and programs, perhaps with Miami Community College. Those are the sorts of things that speak for themselves and communicate both internally and externally. We never got around to the 5 questions, which is great. So we're doing 5 questions, no 5 questions, 5 questions, no 5 questions. Who's the last group? You're doing 5 questions. Thank you.
That was great.
Hello. So we were the how do we best support our member institutions, which actually what a lot of people already said relates to our conversation. So one of those things was actually, and it relates to definitions, thinking about like, what do we mean by each of these things? like creating like research briefing documents that shares like, these are our definitions, this is the research behind that. So like pooling a lot of the national data to inform, the presentations we give, being able to, think about how we generate buy-in in these different spaces. We also picked up on the coaching model conversation. We were talking about how helpful it would be to have like some sort of like matchmaking mechanism of those who are working on similar issues, whether, I think about like the purposeful work, anything around like purpose and work, like having matchmaking around that to support institutions who are working on shared spaces, or even similar institutions in terms of, student body, demographics, to help people connect. We also talked about communications, again, picking up on a lot of other conversations, and we're talking about how helpful it would be to have some centralized toolkits specifically around communication. So what are your kind of like, templates, strategies, approaches, specifically around communications even, to think about supporting the work at other institutions. We talked about assessment and thinking about assessment resources, thinking about assessment on-ramp, longitudinal assessment. How do we build up those structures at our institutions related to this larger conversation around how are we defining student success beyond retention persistence, to think about how are we measuring that more broadly. And then we also discussed I don't know what it would be, but like a guidebook or suite of resources that are thinking about everything from small, practical, actionable approaches that you could take tomorrow to start doing this work at your institutions, to more of like, to use Angela's word, more moonshot. What are the kinds of approaches that get at more of the moonshot institutional level approaches, to think about at any one institution, you could be working at those different levels at any one time, thinking about both like the small practical strategies that could be deployed to the more moonshot approaches. So thinking about how we can support institutions, thinking at all of those levels. Anything else from, okay. Who am I passing this to? Oh, okay. Oh, those were kind of 5. Was I supposed to say something else?
Yes, you did a wonderful job. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you all for putting the time into those thoughts and jotting down ideas. Again, if there are other things that maybe didn't get mentioned, please do write them down. You have some paper and pens in front of you. And again, each person can, and I would say should, write down those 5 things. We'd love to get the 5 items that are foremost in your minds, each one of you as individuals, that we can collect so that we have 250 ideas that we can somehow process and figure out what to do with. So thank you again for all of that. Thank you for doing all that. Kind of give yourselves applause. I think there was a wonderful presentation, some wonderful thoughts.